Okay, hi everybody. With the class cancellations we've had, I'm going to record a video lecture to try and get us caught up a little bit on material so that we're not falling too far behind the syllabus. Uh, so where we've been talking about lately, we were in the 19th century and looking at a lot of the cultural changes and intellectual changes that had been going on. And one aspect of these changes was industrialization, evolutionary thought and science, eventually towards the end of the 19th century, Freudian psychology, Marxism as a political ideology with its um, idea that religion is the opium of the people and so forth. You've got a lot of challenges to traditional religiosity in any of the forms that we've seen so far. So what I really want to do now is talk about some of the changes that go on in the religious scene in Europe over the course of the 19th century, especially in the second half of the 19th century and rolling over into the 20th century. Um, in one dimension, a very practical dimension, you get an important phenomenon happening related to the French Revolution, related to the Napoleonic Wars, and some of the changes that Napoleon makes as he occupies various territories, and then being imitated by other rulers after Napoleon has been deposed on a case-by-case basis in various areas, and that's secularization, not in a broad cultural sense, but in a very specific legal sense, secularization of church property. Down through the 18th century, especially in Roman Catholic areas, the church had been or churches had been very important landholders. They'd held major estates. They had had very significant buildings and architecture and so forth. And what you see a lot of rulers doing in the early 19th century, sometimes inspired by revolutionary ideals or by liberal ideologies, is they will often move to secularize church property. They'll review the place of the clergy or of the inhabitants of these properties. If we're thinking, say, nuns in a convent or monks in a monastery, you still have a lot of institutions in the Roman Catholic areas called chantries, which are basically churches that exist solely for the sake of priests and monks saying masses for the souls of the dead without any sort of outward ministry or pastoring of local congregations. There's a lot of review of these kinds of things. A lot of these institutions are fairly wealthy, but only have a small number of clergy actually involved with them or working in them. Sometimes you might only have a handful of nuns in a whole gigantic convent, or a dozen monks or something like that in a monastery possessed of significant amounts of property. And so, under the influence of secular ideals, Enlightenment ideals, rational ideals, or liberal ideas, there'll be a move to confiscate a lot of this property, a lot of these buildings, consolidate the church personnel into a smaller number of larger institutions, sort of get them all together in one place, and then turn the confiscated properties over to other purposes. They might be sold at auction, becomes a bit of a windfall for a government treasury. In some cases, they might be granted out as rewards or for uses of other things. I'll give an example I'm aware of personally. In the city of Regensburg in southern Germany, in Bavaria, you have a place where you used to have a monastery. It was the monastery of St. Emmeram. And what they do is they detach it and they take the monk's church, and the church becomes a parish church for a neighborhood where people are going to take their babies to get baptized and so forth. So the church becomes a parish church, and the rest of the monastic complex, all what used to be dormitories and refectories and chapter houses and all these other structures that were associated with the monastery, become a palace that gets handed over to a family called the Tornentaxis family, who are the people who had created the Habsburgs' postal system. And so this sort of becomes their reward for creating a postal system that spans between Italy and Germany and across to Austria and Hungary and so forth. They get this confiscated monastery. Basically, it becomes a palace that the family is now going to use as their residence. So there's a lot of this seizure of church property. Liberal ideology calls for freedom of religion. That's one of the things coming out of that direction of Enlightenment ideology. And so there's also a lot of talk about disestablishment. In most areas of Europe, you do not have a separation of church and state. You have churches which are legally acknowledged as the official church, as the church of the monarchy. It's often required that someone practice that official religion to become the monarch. You have to be Protestant and in the Church of England if you want to be the monarch of England, and so forth. So you have these official church establishments in many countries in Europe. The 19th century sees a disestablishment movement picking up speed over the course of it in order to sever those links and have no official church at all. Now, that proceeds to varying degrees in varying countries. If you look at the British Isles, for instance, the Anglican Church, a Protestant church, created by Henry VIII originally, and which had been following the shape of the Elizabethan settlement, had been the established state church throughout British dominions. That includes Wales, that includes Scotland, that includes Ireland, and so forth. In the course of the 19th century, it gets disestablished from those outlying principalities, from Wales, from Scotland, from Ireland, and becomes the established church only of England itself within Great Britain. Right, so there's things like that where it doesn't get completely disestablished, but there is a movement towards disestablishment, sort of taking away the legal privileges and the legal preference for one type of church or another. So you see movements in this direction in various parts of Europe to varying degrees. You still, even to this day, you have some European nations where there are established churches, or at least officially recognized churches, which have some sort of legal status or government provision for them one way or another, but it varies to a great extent. But overall, the 19th century is going to see the relaxation of a lot of those official ties and opening up for a lot more freedom of religion than used to be the case. Related to that is a major change for the Jewish population of Europe. We haven't spoken about the Jews too much. They've been sort of, in a sense, having a history of their own. The 16th century, way back towards the earlier part of this course, had seen the creation of an institution called the ghetto, right, which we often use now to talk about urban areas. But originally, the original ghettos were a development out of the old Jewish quarters. Medieval cities very often would have a Jewish quarter, a part of town where the Jews would live. When you have a ghetto introduced, it's going a step beyond it because it means you generally will have legal regulations requiring Jews to live inside the ghettos. The ghettos would often be walled and gated and separated off, kept very distinct from the surrounding Christian majority community. And the real estate inside the ghetto was not owned by the Jews themselves. They were dependent on Christian landlords to whom they would be paying rent and who would have a certain amount of power over them. So ghettoization had been the culmination of a process of isolating and removing Jews from European society in lots of ways. And a lot of Jewish history over the course of the 16th, 17th, 18th century had been sort of pursuing their own cultural lines within these ghettoized communities. In the 19th century, with the rise of liberal ideals starting to influence politics quite a bit, a lot of people talking about equality before the law and freedom of religion, this starts people thinking differently about the question of the Jewish minorities living in their countries. And so you get this closing down of the ghettos, or perhaps an opening up of the ghettos might be, an abolition of the ghetto system, where Jews will, laws that had obligated Jews to live inside of ghettos are abrogated, and Jews are allowed to move outside and live where they want to. You have relaxation of laws that would have prohibited Jews from things like property owning and things like that, or prevented them from holding certain positions, so they're able to move much more freely and interact with outside society in many more ways than they used to be allowed to do, right? So sort of big opening up of the Jewish minority into European society more broadly. That's going to throw open a whole lot of questions, right? You still have an awful lot of anti-Semitic sentiment in the general population. There are a lot of negative stereotypes about the Jewish population going around. So you are going to have instances of friction. You're going to have conflict. In some cases, you're going to have persecution. In Eastern Europe, especially places like Poland and Russia, you have pogroms where Jews will be systematically persecuted or hunted down. You will also have this be a major question within the Jewish community itself. what it meant to be Jewish and how you maintained your Jewish identity was obvious enough when you all have to live in the ghetto together and you have your synagogue there and your rabbis and the life of the community going on. But when you're no longer having that barrier imposed around you, when you're no longer getting walled in and you necessarily have to form a community together, then what does it mean to be Jewish, right? How do you practice your Judaism? How do you interact with the world around you? This is going to mean you're going to see a split of European Judaism into three broad categories. You're going to have a group which is going to embrace the changes and is going to argue that Judaism needs to adapt itself and reform itself in order to integrate itself into the society around it. This is called Reform Judaism. There's going to be much less stringent application or literal application of certain laws and restrictions and so forth. On the other hand, you have a reaction in the other direction that would argue that that reform approach is going to cause Jews to evaporate away into society. They're going to lose their identity as a special people, and so they need to really double down on the things that make them distinct and separate. So you get Orthodox Judaism, which calls for a much stricter way of life and much stricter adherence to traditions and commandments as they see it in their religious tradition. And somewhere in between, you get Conservative Judaism that tries to preserve a distinct Jewish traditional identity, but maybe not in quite so strict and literalistic a way as the Orthodox Jews had done, right? So there's a lot of different movements going in different directions within the Jewish community, and they're becoming, anyway, much more involved in European society in lots of levels. Okay, now let's sort of turn around and look at Christianity, and which is still the predominant religion in Europe. And one thing to bear in mind with all this talk of secularization, confiscation of church property, we've seen the rise of deism. We mentioned with Darwin, the possibility of atheism starts emerging, especially with religious freedom now being affirmed in more and more areas. While all those things are coming onto the horizon and are becoming things that people are going to be practicing and different alternatives that people will be following, you're nevertheless still going to see the majority of the European population taking for granted that religion is necessary to society and that they're going to be practicing some form of Christianity, one version or another of Protestantism or, a Roman Catholicism in some sense. So even, in the 19th century, right through the 20th century, really to a great extent, even with all the new options and all the new secular directions that become possible and all the new ways of thinking, you still have to bear in mind that the majority of people are still practicing some kind of a Christian tradition in one form or another that they've inherited, back from the days of the Reformation and the Middle Ages. Nevertheless, still, big changes are happening. Lots of ways that Christianity is responding to all these changes. In the Protestant world, particularly, to some extent there's influence, you get the rise of religious liberalism, which is distinct from political liberalism. You don't want to confuse the two, although you might often find the same individuals holding both points of view. You had a reading from Friedrich Schleiermacher to take a look at online from the Christian Classics Ethereal Library. Which, with all the class cancellations, we won't have time to discuss in detail, but Schleiermacher, writing early in the 19th century, is really laying out a new way to think about Christianity that's going to become the building block for this new Christian liberalism, or liberal Christianity, either way, that you want to take it there. And basically, if you look at that text, what Schleiermacher does is he redefines the essence of religion in a radical way. And in some ways, it actually does parallel the difference between conservative and liberal political ideologies. Rather than taking the traditional view that religion is something which, or authentic religion, comes from on high, right? That it comes from the top down through revelations, through traditions, through authorities that people have to subscribe to. Schleiermacher instead argues that religion is more of a bottom-up phenomenon. He's thinking here in a romantic vein. He's thinking of the way that the Romantics will talk about the human spirit, human feeling, human sentiment, right? This idea of the human spirit as the noblest part of the self, the most human part of the self, the most essential part that needs to be cultivated for a full human life. And so when Schleiermacher talks about religion, he argues that true religion is not so much belief in or obedience to or following a revelation that's been handed down from on high, right? It's not obedience to authority. It's not about dogma, right? It's not about submission in that kind of a way, but rather he argues that it is about the individual's spiritual experience, right? Schleiermacher argues that true Christianity, and he is still operating within a Christian framework, but the true experience of religion, the true experience of Christ, the true experience of salvation, is something that wells up inside the person. A person has an experience which causes rituals, traditions, institutions, scriptures to take on meaning and become saving for the person, right? So instead of that top down, you hear the message, you read the Bible, you hear the sermon preached, and you listen to it and you believe it and you change your life accordingly to follow it. Schleiermacher argues that the primary thing, rather, is that your inmost spirit encounters the indescribable, transcendent other, the beyond, the infinite that's out there in the cosmos. And then, sort of, that experience, that encounter, expresses itself through various religious manifestations like worship and churches and institutions and so forth. So this is a real big shift, a shift from the top down to the bottom up, or from the exterior to the interior. If you think about the varieties of Christianity we've talked about beforehand, you may recognize that this is not coming out of a clear blue sky, right? There are already trends within Christianity. Pietism, for example, and Schleiermacher is certainly conscious, very conscious of the pietist tradition. Pietism had put that emphasis on the religion of the heart, and that real faith is not outward obedience or adherence. Real faith is, what comes from inside the person when the Holy Spirit moves in their heart. Evangelicalism had talked about the conversion experience, right? Jansenism in the Catholic world had been teaching something similar. So Schleiermacher is kind of starting from that point, but all those varieties had still kind of assumed that nevertheless you have an authoritative scripture, you have an authoritative church that's within those frameworks that the individual experiences conversion or cultivates their piety, right? Schleiermacher has really pushed those things aside to a great extent, made them much more secondary, and made the individual experience, right? Religion is no longer so much God speaking to man and saying, this is what you need to do, but rather man seeking God, and it becomes this kind of spiritual quest that people are on. To varying degrees, Schleiermacher's ideas are going to become very influential in seminaries, among university students. It's going to start filtering into. He's writing very, very early in the 19th century. By the time you get a generation on, the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, you're starting to have university students who are reading him. Some of them are going to seminary, some of them are going into ministry, they're becoming pastors and priests and these various other kinds of clergy, and they're starting to preach in ways that are inspired by Schleiermacher. They're starting to do their theology in ways that are inspired by Schleiermacher in various ways. And this is really going to start having an impact on the flavor of European Christianity. A lot of it's going to take on this liberal overtone to it. Not all necessarily whole hog radical Schleiermacher, but at least these ideas are starting to filter in and have an influence in the way that people think about what their religion is all about. One of the things that's going to mean is that there's going to be a strong association of religion with sentimentality, right? You have that borrowing from Romanticism happening there again, or at least this interpretation of religion in the light of Romanticism going on, where emotion, sentiment, the higher feelings, right, the sort of emotional life is going to start taking more and more of a primary place rather than doctrine, rather than dogma, rather than believing in certain propositions. Religion becomes more something that you feel. It sort of becomes a certain category of emotions that you experience, and then you're feeling religious. As this emotional life becomes more and more primary. There's also, along with this sidelining of dogma, there's going to be a lot more focus on religion as a source of morality, right? These are going to be your nobler sentiments, your better feelings, and sort of the ones that inspire you to behave in a more charitable fashion, in a more self-controlled fashion, in a more generous fashion, a more loving fashion, so on and so forth. So this real shift over into sentiment as the essence of religion, even more so than you had with the Pietists, and a shift towards morality being sort of the good of religion. From as you're having more deists and more atheists coming along, and the Darwinists and so forth, and the Marxists saying, what's religion good for? Is this not a terrible thing? The answer is often going to be religion inspires good moral sentiments that society needs in order to be able to continue to function and not to completely devour itself. So this sort of idea that religion is this necessary um, lifeblood that makes society sort of remain good and moral and not devolve into some sort of horrible social Darwinist dog eat dog kind of a world. One byproduct of that, if you think about it, and if you've been paying attention to some of the shifts that we've been talking about going on with industrialization, is you have a phenomenon that's been called the feminization of religion, right? Another very key kind of an element here. If you think back to your Reformation era, your Reformers, your Martin Luthers, and your John Calvins, and on the Catholic side, people like Ignatius Loyola. If you think about your evangelicals and your pietists, Count von Zinzendorf and Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield and John Wesley and these various people, there had been for a long time this very sort of masculine quality, right? This sort of assumption that comes from patriarchal society. The Bible's a pretty patriarchal document. It tends to, whenever it does talk about gender issues, it puts men in a leading role, in a dominant kind of a role. And so there had always been this sort of sense that the ministry was an honorable, manly thing for a man to pursue, and that there was a sort of, kind of a masculinity to all of this. Um, the divorce of the home from the workplace and the gendering of that divorce so that the workplace becomes the amoral, competitive, dog eat dog world that men go into to compete and struggle in this capitalistic battle to bring home the bacon, so to speak. And the home becomes this shrine of morality and sensitivity and sentimentality, which is maintained by women. Well, if you look at the direction that liberal theology is taking Christianity in, you may notice those values that sort of are promoted in this liberal vision really align much better with the home values, right? They don't really seem to fit very well into the business world, into the external competitive capitalist or political kind of environment. And so with this, you get a strong association that although men should be good Christians and be believers and so forth, there's a certain sense that religion is most purely practiced by women, right? This becomes almost more and more of a women's sphere, where the women are going to be the keepers of the faith, the tenders of the flame, the ones who are going to raise the children to say their catechisms and say their bedtime prayers and sing their hymns and sing Jesus loves me, what have you. And the sphere of religion comes to seem more and more like a woman's sphere, actually, even though you don't have ordination of women to positions of authority in the church. The churchmen, the clergy, are still male, but there's a sense that the women are kind of the heart of the church. And that's going to lead in turn to some other interesting gender ramifications of the shifts going on in religion, shifts going on in society. One is that it changes the perception of clergy, right? You have a bit of a crisis of masculinity among the clergy. It's still taken for granted that your average clergy person is going to be male and that you're going to have male priests and male pastors and so forth, male preachers. But men who enter the clergy are no longer seen as masculine the same way that a businessman or a doctor or a lawyer or a politician is, right? The proper manly masculine fields to go into tend to be seen more and more as being in those kinds of fields, those secular fields. Those are the ways for sort of serious men to go into and stake their claim and make their mark in the world. The clergy, by comparison, are relegated over to the world of private life, to the world of sentimentality, the world of morality. You get these sort of stereotypes of the clergy sort of doing the rounds, going having afternoon tea with the church ladies, right? They're not in male society rubbing shoulders and muscling around the way the men do. Clergy sort of belong in this much more delicate female sort of a sphere. You do get a counter reaction to that. There's a general tendency to sort of see the clergy in this feminized kind of a way, or emasculated kind of a way, like they're not as fully manly as other kinds of men are. you will have a counter reaction where you get this assertion of the manliness of the clergy, or the sort of sense that that manliness has been lost and needs to be recovered. So late in the 19th century, you see a number of manifestations of what's sometimes called muscular Christianity, this sort of very aggressive effort to re-masculinize things and sort of have this very kind of muscle, athletically oriented notion of what Christianity is about. In the English-speaking world, between the U.S. and Britain, especially, for example, you see this is when you get the foundation of the Young Men's Christian Association, right, the YMCA, which is originally conceived of as a kind of a missionary organization. Both foreign missions are sending, they're getting people to go out on foreign missionary enterprises, but also domestic missions. This idea that you're going to set up a YMCA facility, and this is going to be a place where you're going to be reaching out to young males in urban centers, these kind of single men working in the factories that might sort of fall adrift and fall into drinking and fall into, prostitution, chasing prostitutes around or something. And you want to kind of redeem them and convert them and, make good Christian men out of them. So you bring them into the YMCA. This is where it all originates. Of course, when most of you think about the YMCA, you basically are probably thinking about a gym, right? And that's not accidental. The original 19th century vision is you have this mission center reaching out to young men to make good Christians of them and maybe train them to be missionaries and things. But the idea is you want a strong soul in a strong body. You want to redeem people body and soul. And so this idea that you're going to have this athleticism, you're going to have exercise and competition, play basketball, whatever, going on in the YMCA. And this is all going to be part of body and soul, sort of training these, strong young Christian men to go forth into the world. So that sort of captures this. There's a lot of gender stuff going on. Of course, you get a YWCA then to be the counterpart of it. The other thing is that religious interests become a major channel by which women enter public life, right? We've talked about the whole issue of suffragettes. They're not going to successfully get the vote until early in the 20th century in most areas in Europe. But and generally, especially for middle class women and upper class women, they're sort of being confined to this domestic sphere, right? It's been divorced away from the workplace. But religion is a sphere where, as we've said, women are kind of seen to be at the heart of things. And so for a lot of these women who don't have to work, we're not talking working class women, we're talking middle class women and upper class women, they've got a lot of free time on their hands. They've got these households, they're, the status of the family, their middle class respectability is precisely that they don't have to work for a living. But especially once the kids grow a little bit, they don't want to just sit around bored and idle, sitting around their pretty homes. And so what you get is women becoming central to voluntaristic movements, right? Movements you volunteer for, all kinds of charity enterprises. Women are serving on Sunday school boards. They are serving on missionary boards. All these kinds of things where they can't be ordained into the priesthood or into becoming pastors, but they find all these other things to do, right? Running a soup kitchen, running an orphanage, running a school. You have tract societies and Bible societies going out into the cities, distributing religious literature to people and trying to get them to come there. Temperance societies, in order to restrain people from excessive drinking or indeed from drinking at all, get everybody to be teetotalers. That's a major movement. The evils of drink, very much driven by female activists. And it's really, in a sense, we almost jumped the gun, in a sense, talking about the suffragettes, because a lot of that public activity you see in the suffragette movement is building off of a foundation of female activism in these other kinds of charitable and social movements, these various organizations, organizations they're volunteering for, boards they're serving on, things they're doing along those lines, where they start coming out and starting to have a role and a voice in external society. In the US, it gets called the benevolent empire. I'm borrowing off US history here a little bit. That term doesn't get used in Europe so much, but if you look at a lot of these places in England and Germany and Scandinavia and places like that, you see similar things going on, these kinds of various boards, organizations, institutions where women really are stepping in and playing the dominant role in lots of ways, and that's becoming their chief avenue that they're becoming a voice in public society. in lots of ways. Okay, so that's all a very major feature, and you'll see all that going on, people organizing all these different sorts of organizations. Um, Another phenomenon that you see developing, especially again towards the later 19th century, 1880s, 1890s, as religious freedom and the idea that people could practice whatever religion they want, or indeed no religion at all, owing to disestablishment and so forth. You Along with it, you're also going to get the rise of esoteric religions and esoteric spirituality. Excuse me. Esoteric meaning exotic or occult or unusual in some sense, right? Ways in which people are starting to construct forms of religiosity, forms of spirituality that are really branching away from the practice of traditional Christianity or traditional anything, and really coming up with very different notions of how this is all going to work. Um, Again, Romanticism is behind quite a bit of it. There's a strong sense of the inspiration of the individual soul, of the individual insight, of the idea that a person has perceived something or had a vision of something or had a awakening to something that maybe is not publicly accessible to all people, but they're then going to sort of build a spirituality and start talking about their experience, their insight, their ideas to lots of other people. Um, so the second half of the 19th century is really a very creative period in which people are developing all these sort of exotic, esoteric types of spiritualities and drawing followers to them. None of them are becoming mass institutionalized religions necessarily. Not in Europe. You'll have some that will in the Americas, like the Mormons or the Christian Scientists or somebody. Those don't catch on quite so much in Europe, although they do send missions over and win some adherents. One major group, for example, though, would be the Swedenborgians. Emanuel Swedenborg, he's actually from Sweden, so it's easy to remember Swedenborg from Sweden, has this vision for a new kind of church. He understands it as a new Christianity. He'll talk about you had an Old Testament, you had a New Testament, and now he's coming up with a third testament and claiming to be receiving divine revelations, writing new scriptures, building new churches, and kind of developing all this as he goes along in these unique and distinct sort of directions. So the Swedenborgians catch on. I'm not going to trouble you too much with specific doctrines or anything like that. A lot of it is sort of taking traditional Christian ideas about Jesus Christ and salvation, sort of putting various kinds of spin on them in different sort of directions. Tends to be a religion that sees people as a blank slate, and then you're sort of pursuing either the good or the bad as you're caught in this kind of gravitational pull between heaven and hell. If you sort of imagine, the vision you get from movies with sort of an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other, and they're trying to pull you different directions. Swedenborgians are very much like that. That's kind of, but they take that angel and devil very seriously, very, very seriously. You're actually in this world of spiritual forces trying to pull you in different directions, and you use your free will to chart your course between them and hopefully, go in the right direction. So Swedenborgians like that. There's groups like the Freemasons. They had actually originated back in the 18th century. Get their title because they claim to be derived from actual guilds of masons, guilds of stonecutters. But Freemasonry becomes this whole other thing where they form these associations called lodges. They develop a whole set of rituals surrounding it, and often kind of adopt Enlightenment ideas, but also this idea they sort of have this secret knowledge that's not open to the rest of the world. It's almost sort of conspiratorial, sort of a world where they're going to be moving the world towards a greater good through the exercise of this sort of spiritual influence that they have. So that's kind of behind the Freemasonry movement comes quite widespread in certain circles. Another example you'll get 1890s in Britain, for example, there's a group called the Golden Dawn, which is intriguing. They really start getting interested in occultism, right? They're interested in ideas about magic and alchemy. Here you can sort of see that romantic counter-reaction over against the Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment and the sort of scientific end of the world is dismissing all this stuff and saying that's all superstition you want to get rid of. The Romantics are coming along saying, no, 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 this is, this magical stuff is where you tap into the greater depths of the spirit and maybe deeper, higher realities that you can't get at through rationality in science. So you'll get this group, the Golden Dawn, forming in Britain, other groups forming elsewhere, that will try to cultivate this kind of occult idea where they're trying to hold rituals that will summon spirits, or have mediums that will be able to communicate with spirits or with the spirits of the dead, things like that. There's a British writer, Aleister Crowley, very prominent in it. Traditional Christian figures react very violently against him. They call him the most evil man who ever lived. He's sort of trying to turn Christianity on its head and say, no, no, Satan is the real source you want to go to. He promotes this kind of neo-paganism, promoting this idea of worshiping ancient gods, and worshiping Satan as kind of the alternative to what he sees as an oppressive and false and repressive Christian identity there. Crowley in the Golden Dawn and some of these other esoteric groups, they're also really inspired by Orientalism. In some ways, they're kind of a byproduct of European imperialism, as Europeans are increasingly exposed to goods coming in from abroad. Your domestic middle-class household is going to have tea from China. For that matter, it's going to have china from China, right? Porcelain goods like that. You're having perfumes coming in from Arabia. You're having jewels that will have come from India or from Africa, silks and things. Just if you sort of look in your middle-class Victorian home, it's all decorated and ornamented with all sorts of goods that have been brought in from around the world. You're also starting to think about, okay, the beliefs, the philosophies, the religions, the rituals of these various areas. Aleister Crowley is constantly traveling. He goes to Egypt and he sort of tries to study hieroglyphics and the pharaohs and study the Book of the Dead from Egypt and recreate its rituals and bring them back to England and dress up like a pharaoh or like an Egyptian priest and recreate these rituals to commune with the sun god and these kinds of things. Goes to India, goes to other parts of the world, and kind of wherever he can find some mystical practice or ritual, he'll tap into it and try to repeat it and incorporate it into his own very idiosyncratic worldview and philosophy of trying to construct this alternative spirituality. Crowley's just one example. He's kind of an extreme example, but you sort of get the idea. Again, not the totally average individual, but you're starting to have more fortune tellers, tarot cards become a thing. All this sort of stuff starts becoming part of the popular culture on the street corners of late 19th century, early 20th century cities, where people are starting to have this interest in these kinds of alternative, mystical kinds of realities that they think they can hope to tap into, or hope is going to connect them to some sort of a higher reality, a higher spirituality, one way or the other. So these are all a lot of the developments that are going on as the world is opening up from traditional Christianity just being the thing. The other thing is, though, also you will get new movements that will react over against liberal Christianity, that will react over against all these various new ideas, that will sort of try to reinvent in a conservative vein what people understand as traditional religion or old-time religion. In the English-speaking world, you get the rise of fundamentalism, more of an American phenomenon, although you do get fundamentalists, Protestant fundamentalists showing up in Britain as well. There is a British wing to the movement. There are some people who are sympathetic to it across Europe. Not a hugely European movement broadly. But fundamentalism, though, where you do have something like it taking hold, is fundamentally an anti-modernist movement, right? If you think about those intellectual challenges the 19th century brings to traditional Christianity, things like Marxism, things like Freudianism, things like evolution, Darwinism, things like the biblical higher criticism, right? This idea that the Bible is not a single text delivered to a prophet or a set of prophets by God, but that this all pieced together from pre-existing texts, has all been edited and patched together for human interests and human purposes. Fundamentalism is fundamentally a reaction over against those ideas, right? A doubling down on traditional doctrines on the authority of the Bible. Fundamentalism's a Protestant phenomenon, which had always been sola scriptura, the Bible alone, as the basis of authority. Fundamentalism will double down on literalistic interpretations of the Bible, right? No, we don't believe in evolution. We believe in, creation, instant creation in the course of, 7 days, and they have to be literal days that all happened at once. We don't believe in a world that's millions of years old that gradually evolved. None of that stuff. So you get the fundamentalist reaction over against Darwinism and over some of these other new ideas in the Protestant world. Like I say, doesn't really catch on outside the English-speaking world to a great extent, probably because you still have established churches in a lot of European countries, in the Protestant countries. And those establishment churches seem not to be an environment that fundamentalism thrives in the way it thrives in the more American populist kind of environment where the growth of a movement is going to depend on the ability of preachers to gain popular appeal, right? The establishment churches in Europe are much more sort of committed around traditional authority, traditional institutional structure, a sort of more closed body of clergy that have been properly sort of vetted and sort of brought into the circle there, and that sort of doesn't allow for the populist appeal that fundamentalism would have in the U.S. say. So you get some with similar kinds of ideas and sympathies to it, but not the same kind of broad appeal in Europe that it has in the U.S. On the other hand, another kind of a conservative reaction that you're going to have is going to be in the Roman Catholic world, right? Southern Europe, areas like Spain, Italy, France, southern Germany, areas like that. And here it's called ultramontanism, right? Ultramontanism. That's a phrase that means beyond or ultramontane means beyond the mountains, right? Ultra, beyond, montane, montanus, mountain, right? Like Montana, state of mountains. So ultramontanism is beyond the mountains, and what that refers to is the Alps, right, which kind of split Northern Europe from Southern Europe. Ultramontanism in the Roman Catholic world means a focus on the Pope as the source of authority, right? The Pope as the source of authority, going back to those old Reformation controversies and saying, no, the Pope is the final source of authority, and the Pope is the one who really sort of decrees what proper Catholic doctrine and Catholic practice and morality is to be. You had liberal movements within or liberalizing movements within Catholicism as well. You had a movement, for example, called Christian democracy. And in fact, in Europe to this day, you get these kind of center-right parties. They're called the Christian Democrats. You see them in a number of different European countries with these ideas, where what the Christian Democrats were about was sort of taking Catholic ideas about natural law, Catholic social teaching, Catholic morality, ideas about charity, and accommodating that to liberal democratic views, right? The papacy had been very skeptical of liberalism. The papacy had been very skeptical of democracy, continued to be so right down into the early 20th century, tended to continue to assert divine right of kings and that monarchy is the proper divinely ordained form of government. After all, God ordained kings for ancient Israel in the Bible, not, legislative assemblies. So you get a controversy in the Catholic world, right, between the Christian Democrats on the one hand and then the ultramontanists on the other hand, who say, no, authority is top down, God gives it to the Pope, and from the Pope it descends to the rest of the church. The Christian Democrats often would adopt a concept of both political and religious authority they call distributism. Distributism is the idea that all problems should be solved, all authority should be exercised at the most local level possible, right? The idea being that people close to the ground, people in local communities should be self-governing as much as possible, should make their own decisions about how they want to do things and how to solve problems, and you only invoke a higher authority as necessary when a problem cannot be solved by people locally, right? That's the distributist idea. So authority should be distributed, right, out to local communities as much as possible, and higher authorities, central authorities, are only kind of to be appealed to on a secondary basis. So the Christian Democrats, the distributists, were sort of in controversy with the ultramontanists, arguing for no, it's the papacy, and that's where all the authority is going to come from. In Roman Catholicism, this comes to a head at the First Vatican Council. The Vatican, of course, the church in Rome itself. It's where the tomb of St. Peter is. And the popes hold a council there. It's just in the process as Italy is being unified to discuss basically how Roman Catholicism is going to respond to the changing world, and you have these controversies between distributists and ultramontanists. The ultramontanists win, basically, in these controversies at Vatican I. They carry the day. They wind up being the ones who are in control of how the council is going to issue its decrees. And so what you see in Vatican I is a real retrenchment around ideas of Catholic tradition and about the authority of the popes. One of the major doctrines that gets promulgated by Vatican I is the doctrine of papal inerrancy, for instance. This is a doctrine that holds under certain circumstances, right? Not every word that drops from his mouth, but under certain circumstances, which are when pronouncing on an issue that is essential to faith and morals, right? So it has to be necessary to proper faith and necessary to proper morals. And when he's speaking ex cathedra, which is a Latin phrase, it means from the throne. So the idea there must be some kind of a formal, solemn, ritual moment when the Pope sits on a papal throne in Rome and pronounces this officially. When these conditions are met, the Pope speaks infallibly, right? His decision cannot be changed, cannot be revoked, cannot be questioned. It becomes an essential point that all good Catholics must agree with and must submit to. That's a very ultramontanist position, right? This idea that the Pope can speak infallibly. So one thing to recognize about this doctrine of papal infallibility that may not occur to you is that for a long time, the main opponents of a doctrine of papal infallibility had actually been the popes, right? The popes had hated the idea of papal infallibility, which may sound surprising. You may think, why wouldn't they want their pronouncements to be infallible? And the reason why popes had never liked the idea before Vatican I is because if a pope can speak infallibly, then that means future popes are going to have their hands tied by the decisions of past popes, right? That was how the idea of papal infallibility had first come up. It had been brought up way back in the late Middle Ages. There was a reforming branch of the Franciscan order that a pope had granted certain privileges to. Won't go into the details. And they had sort of made that the essence of their spirituality. And then a later pope had said, no, 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 you can't do that. And they would look back to what the earlier pope said, well, and they would claim the earlier pope spoke infallibly, so therefore you can't take these privileges away from us, right? So that was why popes never liked the idea. They didn't like the idea that they, had something they wanted to say, something they wanted to do, a pronouncement they wanted to make, and that, they would be bound and prevented from doing it because someone would say, well, a past pope said the opposite, and now you're stuck, right? But the challenges of modernity, right? The challenges of Marx, Freud, Darwin, biblical higher criticism, liberalism, and so forth, were so strong and were felt by the popes to be so threatening that at Vatican I, they came around to the infallibilist idea, and ultramontane Catholics held the, we need to sort of have a doctrine of infallibility so that we could really push hard on papal authority over against the challenges of the modern world. And they kind of committed Roman Catholicism that way, at least the Roman Catholic authorities that way for generations, for a while down until Vatican II in the 1960s, right, which started to loosen up some of the strictures. At least some Catholics saw it as doing that. We'll see if we ever get into that. Okay, so religion's been a major theme through the course, and hopefully, I didn't want us to sort of drop it in the midst of all these other exciting things that we've been talking about happening, like all these ideologies and industrialization and nationalism and so forth. So hopefully that helps give you a rounded sense of how all these changes going on, political changes, economic changes, social changes, cultural changes, wind up intersecting with the world of religion and bringing in a lot of new possibilities for the way that Europeans are going to think about and practice their religion moving through the 19th century and on into the 20th. We'll stop there. Thank you.